In the heart of the national forest, there's a clearing no map dares to show, because everyone who camps there disappears. Tonight, Dreadscribe writes again. Before we begin, don't forget to like and subscribe for more chilling stories. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. I love seeing where everyone is tuning in from. And if there's a story you'd like me to cover next, I'd love to hear it too. The first night in Black Hollow felt like slipping into a dream I couldn't wake from. My tent sat alone in a clearing swallowed by mist, the kind that clings to your skin and blurs the world into pale, shifting shapes. I'd chosen this place because it was remote, a perfect escape from the chaos of the city, but the forest had a way of making solitude feel like exile. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was watchful, a stillness so heavy it pressed on my chest. I was just about to drift off when I heard it, a whistle threading through the fog. It wasn't like any tune I knew. The sound rose and fell in a strange pattern, looping back on itself like a record skipping. At first I thought it was another camper, maybe someone drunk and lost, but there were no other tents for miles. The whistle felt deliberate, as if the forest itself had learned to breathe through hollow bones. I lay frozen listening while my mind cataloged every possibility, a bird, the wind, maybe even a trick of my tired brain. But no, the pitch was too precise, too mathematical, like the clean lines of a sine wave etched in air. My curiosity warred with fear. I remembered a documentary I'd seen about infrasound, low frequencies humans can't consciously hear, yet which can stir unease, even panic. Some believed haunted places were really just natural acoustic chambers, the earth humming terror into our bones. That thought didn't comfort me. If anything, it made the whistle feel like a message meant for me alone, as though something out there understood my brain better than I did. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent, the cold mist rushing in like an open freezer door. The forest was a cathedral of shadows. Trees stood like pillars, their tops lost in the fog, while my light carved a narrow tunnel through the darkness. The whistle had stopped, replaced by the hiss of wind through wet leaves. I almost turned back, almost convinced myself I'd imagined it, when I noticed something carved into a tree trunk a few feet away. At first glance, it looked like scratches from an animal. But as I moved closer, my breath caught. The markings weren't random. They were symmetrical, repeating lines that curved and dipped like sound waves. Each groove was precise, the wood shaped cleanly as if by a craftsman's hand. I traced them with my fingers, and in that moment the whistle returned. Softer now, almost inside my head. It synced perfectly with the pattern under my touch. Each rise and fall of sound matched by a ridge in the bark. My rational mind screamed for explanation. Maybe it was a local prank, a hiker with a weird sense of humor. But another part of me, the primitive animal part, knew better. This was communication, a conversation carried out in a language older than words. The whistle shifted again, higher now, urgent. My flashlight flickered, casting the forest into strobing glimpses. And then, as abruptly as it had begun, the sound cut off. The silence wasn't relief. It was suffocating. And in that suffocating stillness, I realized with a sick twist of dread, the noise hadn't been a whistle at all. It had been breathing. The realization hollowed me out. What I'd taken for melody was the slow pull and push of lungs working in the dark, close enough to pearl the air. I stood very still, the way animals freeze when thunder rolls, trying to keep my breath from becoming bait. Mist pressed against my face. A branch ticked, then settled. I promised myself I would leave at dawn, but even that felt like a prayer. I followed the carved waves to another trunk, then another, each etched with a progression of curves as if the forest were scoring a symphony I wasn't meant to conduct. The patterns tightened, rising into narrow packets like clipped monitor tones. Lena came to mind, a college friend and sound engineer, who once showed me how frequencies entrain the brain, nudging it toward calm or panic like a hand at the small of the back. If sound could steer feeling, what else could it move? A shape moved at the edge of my vision, more suggestion than mass. I pivoted, sweeping the flashlight. The beam struck suspended droplets and turned the fog into glitter. Nothing solid, yet the breathing continued, a patient bellows. Beneath one carved trunk, the soil was tamped flat, as if something paced there nightly, wearing a metronome into the earth. The pattern was leading me. The next tree bore a deeper groove, a trough smoothed like bone. When I pressed my ear to it, a faint vibration thrummed through the wood. It was not my heartbeat. It was slower, like a ferry engine under planks. If the forest was a body, I was inside its ribcage listening for intent. I pulled back and caught a glint of metal in the needles. Half buried lay a small speaker with a dying LED. Mud sealed its seams. A sticker on the back carried the ranger station's inventory code. A story clicked into place. Emitters, maybe a wildlife study, maybe a deterrent. But speakers cannot exhale, unless the devices were bait and something else had learned to come and answer. I remembered Lena cueing binaural beats and saying the brain is cooperative, hungry for rhythm. I had thought she meant me. Now I wondered if she meant us, wired to follow invisible drums. The breathing deepened, richer, as if recognition pleased it. The mist thinned for a heartbeat, revealing fresh carvings arranged in a circle around a stump, their grooves aligned like spokes. I stepped into the ring. The air felt warmer inside, like standing near an animal's flank. On the stump sat a journal in a plastic pouch. The first page, dated 3 months ago in a tight ranger's hand, described a pilot program using low-frequency sound to steer elk away from fire scars. One line was underlined twice: "Do not remain within a resonant node after nightfall." My light guttered. The breathing paused, then returned with a soft, wet click. Closer now. If the nodes could shape a herd, what were they shaping me into? The final entry broke off mid-sentence. The ink dragged sideways. In the margin, in smaller letters, was my name, as if written while listening. Something behind me drew in another deliberate breath and waited, patient as tide, to hear what I would call it tonight. Trembling still, the fire crackled like a heartbeat in the center of our circle, its orange glow licking upward and casting fleeting halos on the trees. Above us, the sky stretched velvet and endless, the stars sharp and cold like shards of glass scattered across black velvet. We'd come here to escape the noise of everyday life. 5 friends on a weekend camping trip, each of us bringing a story to tell and a bottle to pass. The first night had been laughter and music, but tonight the mood had shifted. We sat closer, voices low, our ghost stories becoming less of a game and more like an ancient ritual meant to keep the dark at bay. As my friend Marcus spoke, his voice trembling as he spun a tale about lost hikers, I noticed something strange in the shadows beyond the firelight. A flicker, a movement that didn't match the swaying of the trees. My rational mind whispered it was just my imagination, but instinct told me otherwise. Out here, our eyes played tricks. I'd once read that in darkness, the rods in our retinas become so sensitive they can mistake patterns of nothingness for predators. Still, the sensation of being watched grew heavier, like a hand pressing down on my shoulder. Then it happened. When Marcus finished his story, he leaned back into the dark edge of the circle and simply wasn't there anymore. No sound, no scream. Just the empty space where he'd been a second before, his half-empty bottle of whiskey rolling to a stop near my boot. We all froze. Someone muttered his name, but the forest swallowed it whole. I scrambled to my feet, scanning the perimeter with a flashlight. The beam cut through the mist, revealing only branches and damp earth. I wanted to believe he'd wandered off as a prank, but my chest felt hollow with a deeper knowing. Predators hunt like this. Sudden, silent, precise. Panic spread through the group like wildfire. Leah grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "We need to leave," she hissed, but my mind was already racing, trying to apply logic. If it was an animal, there would be tracks. If it was a person, there would be noise. But there was nothing. No sign Marcus had ever existed. We huddled closer to the fire, clinging to its warmth. I'd always thought of campfires as safe havens, like glowing beacons against the wild. But as I studied the ring of light, a terrible thought crept in. What if the fire didn't protect us? What if it marked us instead, like moths drawn to a lantern, easy prey for whatever lurked beyond? Another friend, Jenna, whispered that she'd seen something move behind me. I spun, heart pounding, but saw only darkness breathing between the trees. When I turned back, Jenna was gone. The group erupted into chaos, screams slicing the night. In the span of seconds, 2 more vanished, leaving me alone beside the fire's desperate glow. My breath came ragged as the realization set in. The darkness wasn't just taking us, it was waiting for me. And the fire, it was only making me a living thing with lungs that exhaled mist and silence. I spun in frantic circles, the flashlight trembling in my hand, its weak beam darting like a frightened animal. The fire popped behind me, a sharp crack that made me flinch as though struck. My friends were gone, erased, as if the earth had swallowed them whole, and all that remained was the whispering night and the gnawing question of whether I would vanish next. I forced myself to think like a tracker, like my grandfather had taught me when I was a kid. The forest leaves clues, he'd said, but only if you're brave enough to look. Dropping to my knees, I swept the ground with my light, searching for footprints, broken branches, any sign of disturbance. There was nothing. No rustle of fabric, no crushed leaves where they had sat seconds earlier. It was as if their very weight had been erased. My rational mind rebelled. Even predators left evidence. Yet this thing, whatever it was, seemed to consume not just flesh, but proof itself. My pulse thudded like war drums in my ears as I stumbled back toward the fire. Its glow felt suddenly wrong, too bright, too eager, like an open wound bleeding into the night. I remembered reading about how some deep-sea creatures used bioluminescence to lure prey closer, dazzling them before striking. The thought chilled me. Maybe the fire wasn't my protection. Maybe it was the lure. I decided to test it. Clutching a burning stick, I backed away from the circle of light, moving into the darkness. The forest swallowed me immediately, the blackness so complete it felt like stepping into water. My other senses sharpened, the damp smell of moss, the prickle of cold air against my skin, the faint hum of insects far away. Behind me, the fire flickered like a dying sun. My eyes began to adjust, and for a moment I thought I saw movement. Not a creature exactly, but a distortion, like heat waves rippling through the trees. Then I heard it. The tiniest shuffle, almost imperceptible, perfectly timed with my breath. Predators stalk by rhythm, I realized. They match the cadence of their prey so their approach feels like your own heartbeat. Panic clawed at my throat. I swung the torch wildly, catching only fragments of mist and bark. The distortion vanished. Driven by instinct, I bolted toward the fire, desperate for its false comfort. As I crossed into the glow, I saw them, all four of my friends, standing silently at the edge of the circle, their faces blank, their bodies unnaturally still. Relief surged through me, then curdled into dread. Their shadows didn't match their forms. They stretched and twitched, like puppets pulled by invisible strings. Leah's mouth opened, but no sound emerged. The fire roared higher, feeding on something I couldn't see. That's when I understood. The darkness hadn't been devouring them at all. It had been reshaping them. And now, with the circle complete, it was reshaping me. The last thing I felt was heat on my skin as the fire flared blindingly bright, and then the world went utterly, impossibly silent. I woke to the sound of dripping leaves and the slow breath of the forest. My tent was damp with morning dew, the air sharp and metallic like the taste of a bitten tongue. The previous night had been uneventful, a quiet camp pitched along a clearly marked hiking trail. I'd memorized every twist of the path, every cluster of birch trees and outcroppings of stone, a breadcrumb trail etched in my mind. But when I unzipped the tent and stepped into the pale light of dawn, the world outside had shifted. The trail was gone. Where there had been a wide, well-trodden path leading back toward the parking area, there was now only a latticework of narrow tracks spiraling off in different directions. It was like waking up to find the walls of your own house rearranged in the night. My first thought was that fog had obscured my sense of direction. My second was far worse, that I had somehow been moved while I slept. I tried to laugh it off, to cling to reason like a lifeline. Forests are living things, ever-changing. Trees fall, branches shift. Perhaps I was just disoriented from sleep. But the deeper I looked, the more wrong it felt. Landmarks I'd passed yesterday, a boulder shaped like a crouching animal, a fallen tree marked with orange trail paint, were missing, replaced by features I didn't recognize. It was as if someone had lifted entire pieces of the forest and rearranged them while I dreamed. Panic flared in my chest. I pulled out my compass, but the needle spun aimlessly, quivering like a trapped insect. I recalled an article I'd once read about magnetic anomalies, pockets of Earth where iron-rich stone warped navigation tools and even interfered with the brain's own internal map. Birds, after all, navigate using magnetic fields. Could humans be affected too? The idea seemed plausible, comforting even. Science had answers. But it didn't explain why my footprints from last night had vanished, erased like chalk beneath a tide. I chose a trail at random, marking the trees as I went. My breathing grew shallow as the forest closed around me. The canopy seemed lower, the light dimmer, as if the woods themselves leaned closer to listen. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time became slippery, untrustworthy. When I turned back to check my markings, they were gone. Smooth bark stared back at me, clean and unbroken. My logic crumbled. By late afternoon, exhaustion gnawed at me. I stumbled into a clearing and froze. In the center stood a wooden signpost. Relief surged, but it curdled quickly when I saw the writing. Crude arrows pointing in every direction, each labeled with the same word, home. The sun bled toward the horizon, painting the sky in bruised purples and reds. Shadows stretched long and hungry. I realized then that the forest wasn't random at all. It wasn't a maze. It was a hand guiding me deeper. And somewhere, just beyond my vision, something was waiting for me to arrive. Darkness settled over the forest like a closing fist. My headlamp cut a narrow beam through the mist, but the light seemed swallowed as soon as it touched the trees, leaving the spaces beyond an impenetrable black. Every step I took felt rehearsed, like I was walking in someone else's memory. The signpost with its mocking arrows lingered in my mind, a riddle I couldn't solve. If every path led home, then home wasn't a place. It was a direction someone wanted me to take. As night deepened, the forest began to move in ways I couldn't explain. Landmarks I'd passed seconds before reappeared ahead of me, rearranged like pieces on a chessboard. A crooked tree with two split trunks stood to my left, then inexplicably to my right. My rational brain scrambled for explanations. Fatigue, dehydration, a trick of the light. But my senses rebelled. Even the ground beneath my boots felt different. The soil spongy one moment, rocky the next. I remembered reading about how magnetic fields could distort spatial memory, subtly rewiring how the brain perceives distance and direction. Pilots flying near the poles sometimes reported feeling as though their instruments, and their own instincts, were lying to them. Now I was the faulty instrument, my mind spinning in tight, frantic loops. I stopped to catch my breath, leaning against a tree that felt oddly warm, like flesh beneath bark. My pulse roared in my ears. That's when I noticed the carvings, faint marks spiraling upward along the trunk. At first I thought they were scratches from an animal, but the pattern was too precise. It resembled a magnetic field map I'd once seen in a geology book, swirling lines that suggested unseen currents beneath the earth. Whoever, or whatever, had made these symbols understood the forest in a way I never could. A rustling sound snapped my head up. Somewhere ahead, something moved with deliberate slowness, the way a predator circles before striking. My beam caught only mist and shadow, but the sensation of being watched tightened like a rope around my throat. Instinct screamed at me to run, yet a strange compulsion tugged at my body, pulling me forward. It felt like gravity, but sideways, bending my will as surely as it bent the path. I stumbled into another clearing and froze. A second signpost stood there, older and more weathered, its wood splintered with age. This one had only a single arrow, pointing down a narrow trail lined with stones. In crude, shaky letters, the sign read, "Welcome back." My stomach turned to ice. Back? I'd never been here before, had I? Memories flickered at the edge of my mind. Fragmented images of nights around a campfire, voices whispering my name, a sense of déjà vu so intense it felt like drowning. Behind me, the forest shifted. The trails folded inward, closing like the pages of a book. I realized with bone-deep certainty that the woods weren't lost at all. They were alive, reshaping themselves to lead me exactly where they wanted. As I stepped toward the marked path, the stones began to glow faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. Somewhere beyond the trees, something waited, not hidden, but expectant. And in the moment before the darkness swallowed me whole, I understood the cruel truth. The trail hadn't disappeared overnight. The storm came suddenly. It had been waiting, curtain dropped over the world. One moment, the forest was a quiet cathedral of dripping leaves and distant owl calls. The next, rain hammered my tent in relentless sheets, the sound so loud it drowned my own heartbeat. The nylon walls shuddered and breathed around me, a fragile membrane between me and the black unknown. I'd always thought of tents as sanctuaries, flimsy, yes, but comforting, like a child's blanket fort. Tonight, it felt like a coffin made of fabric and fear. At first, I told myself the pounding of the storm was playing tricks on my ears. But then, beneath the drumming rain, I heard something deliberate. Footsteps. Heavy, measured, circling. The rhythm was wrong for deer, too purposeful for the scatter of small animals. My breath caught. Shadows swayed on the walls, stretched and warped by my flickering lantern, shapes that didn't belong to me. I froze, every nerve screaming to stay silent. The footsteps slowed, almost thoughtful, as if whatever was out there was listening too. The tent walls rippled with each gust of wind, the silhouettes growing longer, then shrinking into strange, contorted forms. I felt like a specimen under glass, observed by something patient and unblinking. Memories surfaced unbidden, jagged fragments from conversations around campfires. Warnings about this forest, stories of hikers who vanished without a trace. They'd called it the hollowing, as though the woods didn't just take people, but emptied them, leaving only the echo of who they'd been. I had laughed then because fear shared in a group feels safe, almost fun. Alone in the pitch dark, the stories felt like prophecy. The human mind is a terrible ally in darkness. I remembered reading once about how sensory deprivation twists perception. When sight is limited, the brain fills the void with imagination, stitching shadows into threats. I tried to cling to that explanation as the shapes around my tent shifted and swayed, but my body wasn't convinced. My pulse raced, my muscles trembled, ancient instincts screaming predator, while logic whispered, maybe it's nothing. Then the footsteps stopped. The sudden silence was worse than the noise. I strained to hear over the rain, my breath loud in the tight space. Slowly, a new sound emerged, a low, almost human exhale, so close it seemed to seep through the fabric. My skin prickled as I realized whatever was out there wasn't just moving around me. It was leaning closer. I reached for the zipper, torn between flight and paralysis. My hand hovered trembling. The lantern flickered violently, and in that stuttering light, the shadows elongated, twisting into grotesque shapes that looked almost intentional, like hands, like faces, like something trying to be understood. The rain began to ease, each drop falling with slow, deliberate weight. For a heartbeat, I hoped the storm's end would bring safety. But then, in the stillness, a single shadow remained. It didn't circle, didn't retreat. It leaned forward, and with agonizing slowness, pressed its hand flat against the thin fabric between us. The shape of the hand was unmistakable. 5 long fingers spread wide, each one trembling slightly as if testing the boundary between its world and mine. I couldn't move. My breath hitched in my throat, trapped like a bird in a snare. The thin nylon between us suddenly felt as fragile as wet paper, a pathetic veil separating me from whatever intelligence lingered outside. I'd once thought of my tent as shelter. Now it felt like a transparent womb, and something wanted to claw its way in. My mind scrambled to explain it, clinging to rationality like a life raft. Maybe it was a lost hiker, drenched and desperate for warmth. Maybe the storm had distorted the shapes and sounds. But deep down, I knew better. There was a deliberateness to the touch, a patience too cold to be human. It wasn't knocking, it was feeling, mapping me by the trembling of my breath against the fabric. The pressure increased, the nylon stretching until tiny beads of condensation formed around the handprint. A faint shuffling began to circle again, but slower now, more methodical. I realized there wasn't just one shadow. There were several. Shapes overlapped, stretched, and then disappeared as if they'd sunk beneath the surface of the night itself. The tent was an island in a vast, black sea, and they were the currents swirling below. I remembered a study I'd once read about fear responses in enclosed spaces. In small, dark rooms, the human brain amplifies threats, making whispers sound like screams and harmless movements feel like attacks. Scientists called it claustrophobic amplification, but no amount of psychology could explain what I was seeing now. This wasn't my mind playing tricks. It was something outside manipulating my mind. The hand slid downward, dragging along the wall with a slow, sickening sound. My body locked in place, muscles aching with tension. Then, without warning, all the shadows vanished. The tent glowed empty and pale in the lantern light. For a moment, hope surged. Maybe they'd left. Maybe the storm had scared them away. Then I noticed the zipper. It trembled, just slightly, like a breath passing over a flute. My heart stuttered. I lunged forward, clutching it shut with both hands. A low sound rose from outside. Not quite a growl, not quite a laugh, something in between. The nylon quivered as unseen shapes leaned against it, testing for weaknesses. My knuckles turned white on the zipper pull. The rain had stopped completely now, and with it, the forest had gone silent. No wind, no insects, no natural sounds at all. It felt as if the world had paused, holding its breath. Slowly, painfully, I lifted my gaze to the tent wall in front of me. There it was again, the hand. Only now there were two, larger, heavier, pressing from both sides like jaws closing around prey. And then, just as the lantern guttered out, I heard a whisper seep through the thin fabric. A single word that sounded eerily like my own name. The ranger had a warm smile, the kind that instantly dissolved tension. When I'd arrived at the remote visitor station that morning, lost and frustrated with the lack of clear trail markings, he'd offered help like a lifeline. From a drawer beneath the counter, he pulled out a piece of paper, a hand-drawn map. The lines were sketched in pencil, soft and smudged. The paper creased as though folded and refolded countless times. "This one's better than the official charts," he'd said, his voice low and confidential, as if sharing a secret only meant for me. "These trails don't appear online or on any GPS system. They'll take you to places most hikers never see." I thanked him with genuine relief, not questioning why something so detailed and intricate wouldn't be made public. The map felt like a gift, a key to a private world. I tucked it carefully into my pack and set off into the woods, the morning sun scattering through the trees like shards of gold. The first few miles were peaceful. The hand-drawn trails wove through ancient groves and rocky ridges, places so breathtakingly quiet it felt like walking inside a cathedral built by nature itself. Birds flitted overhead. The air smelled of pine and cold earth. Everything about the day felt charmed, until I reached the first marked landmark. It was a ring of stones, waist-high, perfectly circular, and far too deliberate to be a natural formation. Moss grew thickly over the rocks, as though they had been there for centuries. Yet the arrangement was pristine, untouched by fallen branches or scattered leaves. Something about it felt ritualistic, unsettling in a way I couldn't quite name. The map's penciled note beside it read simply, "Observe." I didn't linger. The trail beyond seemed to beckon, narrowing as it snaked deeper into the forest. Hours passed and the air grew heavier, the canopy darker. At the next waypoint, my unease deepened. This time I found an abandoned campsite, old canvas tents sagging in decay, rusted pots scattered near a long dead fire pit. It was as if whoever had camped there had simply vanished mid-meal. I crouched to examine a torn backpack, my pulse quickening as I noticed a faded patch stitched to the fabric, the insignia of a local hiking club that had made headlines last year for a group disappearance. They'd been declared missing after a routine weekend trip. Authorities had never found a trace of them. A cold wave of realization rippled through me. The map wasn't guiding me to scenic wonders. It was leading me to graves. Each landmark, I now understood, corresponded to a story of someone lost, swallowed by these woods. I pulled the map from my pack, my hands trembling. Looking at it now, the looping trails resembled a snare, tightening toward a single central point. My stomach dropped as I noticed the faint pencil markings along the outer edges, dates. Each one matched a well-known disappearance case. Somewhere behind me, a twig snapped. The sound was soft, almost apologetic, but it sent a jolt of primal terror through my spine. I turned, heart hammering, certain I was no longer silent. The kind of silence that feels engineered, like a trap waiting to spring. My breath sounded too loud in my ears, ragged and shallow. I clutched the map tighter, my eyes tracing the looping lines toward the central point. The final destination was marked only by a single, ominous word scrawled in rushed handwriting: return. I didn't want to follow it, but the trails seemed to shift around me, funneling me forward no matter which direction I turned. Every instinct screamed at me to run, yet the map felt fused to my hand like a cursed artifact I couldn't discard. With each step, my surroundings grew more surreal. Tree trunks stood unnaturally straight, spaced evenly apart like pillars in a vast open hall. The forest no longer felt wild. It felt designed. The next clearing was worse than the last. A circle of tents stood intact, as if awaiting occupants, though the fabric was rotting and the campfires long cold. Relics were scattered everywhere. A cracked compass, a pair of boots sitting neatly side by side, a thermos half buried in the dirt. They weren't random items. They were personal, intimate, fragments of vanished lives. My stomach turned when I spotted a camera lying in the mud. Its screen flickered weakly when I pressed the button. For a heartbeat, a blurry image appeared. A figure standing among the very same tents, its face obscured by static. Panic clawed at me. I staggered back and collided with something solid. Spinning around, I saw another ring of stones like the first, but this one was different. Blackened symbols had been etched into their surfaces, strange loops and spirals that seemed to writhe when I stared too long. The air above the circle shimmered faintly like heat rising from asphalt. My mind raced, clinging to scraps of logic. I'd read about time distortion in survival psychology, how extreme stress can warp perception, making minutes feel like hours and distances stretch endlessly. But this was more than perception. It felt like the forest itself was bending time, reshaping events like a cruel experiment. A voice crackled softly behind me. At first I thought it was my own mind breaking under pressure. Then I realized it was a radio, a ranger's radio lying near the circle. Static hissed through the speaker, followed by a sound that made my blood run cold. A scream. My scream. The exact pitch and panic of my voice, echoing from a future I hadn't yet reached. I spun in wild desperation and saw him emerging from the tree line, the ranger who'd given me the map. His smile was gone, replaced by something unreadable. He didn't look surprised to see me. If anything, he looked expectant. Why? I managed to choke out, holding the map like a weapon. He didn't answer. Instead, he raised the radio to his lips and adjusted the dial. My scream replayed again, louder this time, merging with the live sound of my own frantic breathing. In that moment, I understood the trap. The map hadn't led me astray. It had led me exactly where he wanted me, where countless others had been before. As the circle of stones began to hum, the forest folded inward, and my own voice filled the night like a prophecy I couldn't escape. The first cry was so faint I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. A thin, quivering sound that floated through the stillness of the night, threading between the trees like a needle through cloth. My campfire had burned low, embers pulsing in the dark like the last breaths of a dying heart. I sat frozen, listening, my hands hovering above the warmth as the wind shifted and carried the sound again, clearer this time. It was unmistakable. A child was crying somewhere out there in the pines. Every rational part of me screamed to stay put. I'd read the warnings posted at the trailhead. Hikers lost after dark, strange auditory phenomena reported. This forest had a reputation for swallowing people whole, but instinct is louder than reason, especially when the cry of a child is involved. It hit something primal in me, a parental cord I didn't even know existed, vibrating with urgency and guilt. The thought of someone small and helpless alone in that vast darkness was unbearable. I grabbed my flashlight and coat, telling myself it would only take a few minutes. Just a quick check to confirm what I already knew, that there was no one out there. The night air was cold and sharp, filled with the resinous scent of pine. My boots sank into the damp earth as I followed the sound, the beam of my light slicing a narrow tunnel through the black. The cries grew louder as I walked, but there was something strange about them. They didn't echo the way they should have in open space. Instead, they seemed to move, weaving between the trees, never quite staying in one place. I'd grown up near the coast, and it reminded me of how foghorns sound in thick mist, directionless, impossible to pinpoint. My chest tightened with unease, but the sound of that desperate wail kept pulling me forward. The deeper I went, the more the forest changed. The orderly pines gave way to a chaotic tangle of underbrush, their trunks leaning inward like conspirators whispering secrets. My flashlight flickered, throwing jagged shadows that danced at the edge of my vision. The crying began to warp, bending in pitch and tone. It wasn't just a child anymore. It sounded like multiple voices layered together, a symphony of grief and terror. Somewhere in the back of my mind, a memory surfaced. A documentary I'd once seen about predators that mimic the calls of prey to lure them closer. Certain birds, even mountain lions, they exploit empathy, using the very instinct meant to protect life as bait. The cries shifted again, blurring into something almost articulate. Fragments of words tangled with the wind, barely audible but unmistakable. My name, whispers of my own name, stretched and distorted. My legs faltered, a surge of icy fear flooding my veins. I stumbled into a clearing, my breath coming fast and shallow. The crying stopped. In its place, silence so profound it rang in my ears. At the center of the clearing stood a single figure, hunched and trembling. My flashlight trembled as I lifted it, and froze. It was me. My own face stared back at me from the darkness, lips moving silently, whispering my name. For a moment, my brain refused to understand what I was seeing. It was like staring into a warped mirror in a carnival funhouse, only there was no glass, no explanation. Just a figure that looked exactly like me standing beneath the twisted canopy of pines. My chest tightened as if a fist had closed around my lungs. My flashlight beam quivered, washing over its features, revealing details so precise they made me nauseous. The same jacket, the same frayed backpack strap, even the tiny scar above my eyebrow from a childhood fall. The figure tilted its head in perfect sync with mine. My rational mind clawed for meaning. Hallucination, I told myself. The brain can misfire in sensory deprivation, especially under stress. The forest, the darkness, the disorientation, they were all conspiring to trick me. But the figure moved with intention, and when its lips parted, the sound that came out was a perfect replica of my own voice. It whispered my name. The words slid into the clearing like a blade, so quiet I almost doubted it was real. My legs buckled. I stumbled backward, choking on air, while the thing that wore my face took a single step forward. The movement was slow, deliberate, almost tender, like a parent coaxing a frightened child. Suddenly, the cries returned, the same desperate wails that had drawn me from my camp. But now they came from every direction at once. Dozens of voices overlapping, echoing. It was as if the entire forest was filled with unseen children, sobbing in unison. The sound clawed at my instincts, driving spikes of panic into my chest. My flashlight flickered wildly, and in those strobing bursts of light, the figure split into multiples. There were dozens of them now, surrounding me, each one a different version of myself. Older, younger, dirt-streaked, wide-eyed. They whispered my name in unison, a chorus of familiarity turned monstrous. I spun in place, disoriented, the world tilting like a broken compass. Somewhere inside the chaos, a cold, analytical part of me surfaced. This was mimicry. I had read about certain insects and birds that lured predators away from their nests by imitating distress calls. But what if something far older, far more intelligent, had learned to mimic us? To copy not just our sounds, but our faces, our memories, our empathy? The clearing seemed to pulse, the trees swaying though there was no wind. My duplicates closed in, their movements jerky now, less human. One of them lunged, and I caught a glimpse of its mouth stretching too wide, its teeth too sharp. My survival instinct roared to life. I bolted through a gap in the circle, branches tearing at my clothes, my lungs burning with each ragged breath. Behind me, the cries shifted. They were no longer weeping. They were laughing, high, thin peals of mockery that echoed through the pines. When I burst back into my campsite, my fire was out, the ashes cold. My pack lay open, the map I'd left folded inside, now torn to shreds. And from the darkness beyond the tree line, a single familiar voice rose above the others, whispering my name in perfect imitation. It was deeper than I'd expected, a jagged spine of rock cutting through the forest, like the back of some ancient, slumbering beast. My breath rose in pale clouds against the cold evening air, each exhale vanishing into the mist that clung stubbornly to the treetops below. The wilderness here was untouched, raw and unsettlingly quiet. Too quiet. Even the usual chorus of insects and birds had gone still, as though the entire forest was holding its breath. That was when I noticed the first sign. A broken twig, splintered cleanly and unnaturally high off the ground. Not the clumsy break of a hiker's boot, but something deliberate, like a signal. I crouched beside it, fingers brushing the sharp edges. My skin prickled. Predators marked their territory in patterns. Wolves with scent, big cats with scratches. This felt similar but wrong. It wasn't meant to warn me away. It was meant to let me know I'd been seen. As I continued upward, More clues appeared. Deep gouges etched into tree bark, spaced too far apart to be from any normal animal. A scattering of stones arranged in a crude spiral, each one dusted with pine needles as though carefully placed by unseen hands. My survival instinct screamed that I was trespassing on something's hunting ground. I'd read once that humans evolved alongside predators far more cunning than wolves or bears, and that our paranoia, the sense of being watched, was a leftover survival mechanism from those ancient days. Tonight, that theory felt terrifyingly real. The sun bled out behind the ridge, leaving the sky bruised purple and red. My headlamp flicked on automatically, casting narrow beams across the trees. That's when I saw them. Two faint points of light hovering in the distance. Eyeshine. At first, they seemed like the reflective glare of a deer. But deer don't blink slowly, deliberately. These eyes did. My pulse surged, hammering against my ribs. I forced myself to breathe evenly, to think. Panic gets you killed faster than teeth or claws. I tried to map its movements in my mind, recalling every snapped twig and displaced stone I'd seen. It wasn't random. It was circling me in widening loops, herding me subtly higher up the ridge. Predators drive prey toward open ground where escape routes vanish. I was being maneuvered, the way humans corral cattle. Somewhere deep inside, a colder part of my brain surfaced. If it was hunting me like prey, then maybe I could flip the script. Primitive humans had survived by setting traps for creatures far stronger than themselves. It wasn't bravery. It was desperation encoded in our DNA. I scanned the rocky terrain, spotting a narrow choke point where the ridge narrowed between two boulders. If I could bait it there, maybe I'd finally see what I was dealing with. I gathered dry branches and set them ablaze, the firelight licking upward like a beacon. My plan was simple: lure it in, reveal it, understand it. But as the firelight flickered, a horrifying thought struck me. What if the creature already knew my plan, and had been guiding me to this exact spot all along? The thought froze me harder than the night air. My trap, my carefully calculated choke point, might not have been my idea at all. Maybe every snapped branch, every eerie spiral of stones, had been breadcrumbs leading me here, like a deer funneled into a hunter's blind. I felt the ancient ancestral fear in my bones. The same fear our earliest ancestors must have felt when eyes glimmered just beyond the firelight. The flames cast grotesque shadows on the rocks, stretching the trees into long skeletal fingers. I crouched low, scanning the darkness for movement. At first there was only silence, heavy and oppressive. Then a soft rustle to my left, the whisper of leaves brushing against something solid. My heartbeat spiked, thudding in my ears like a war drum. Slowly, deliberately, I shifted the fire's glow toward the sound. 2 points of light floated in the darkness, closer now. The same eyes I'd seen before, but their height was wrong, too high off the ground to be a wolf or bear. They blinked slowly, almost mockingly, as if savoring my terror. I forced myself to focus on the pattern, to think like the biologist I'd once studied to be. Predators evolve to exploit weakness. Lions isolate the limping antelope. Wolves test the herd for hesitation. What if this creature wasn't just a beast, but something shaped by eons of hunting us? My mind reeled at the possibility. We were supposed to be apex predators, but what if humans had never truly been at the top? The eyes shifted, gliding from left to right without a sound. My fire cracked sharply, and in that split second I acted. I hurled a burning branch toward the choke point, hoping to startle it into revealing itself. For a heartbeat, the light flared, and I saw it. Tall. Too tall. Its limbs were elongated, almost spidery, its torso narrow and twisted. Patches of mottled fur clung to pallid skin, but its face was wrong. It wasn't an animal's snout or a human visage, but something between, a blur of shifting features that seemed to rearrange when I blinked. My stomach lurched violently. It wasn't a single creature. It was an idea of a predator, adapting moment by moment to the fears it sensed in me. I stumbled back, my trap forgotten. The thing didn't rush me. It didn't need to. Instead, it tilted its head, as if studying me the way I might study a strange insect in a jar. Then, with horrifying precision, it did something I'll never unsee. It stepped neatly around my fire, avoiding the danger I'd so carefully placed. Understanding hit me like a blow. It wasn't acting on instinct. It understood traps. It understood me. I turned to flee, branches clawing at my arms. but a sound rooted me in place. Laughter. Not an animal's growl, but low, guttural laughter echoing through the trees. When I dared to glance back, the eyes were gone. Only the fire remained, crackling helplessly against the vast watching darkness. And in that void, I realized the truth. I hadn't been the hunter tonight. I'd been the lesson. The sign was old, its paint faded to the color of dried bone. Campground 12, it read, an arrow pointing deeper into the forest. I almost turned back, thinking it was nothing more than a relic of a forgotten hiking route. But something about the starkness of that number tugged at me. 12. Even. Complete. Safe. The trail narrowed as I followed it, the forest pressing in on both sides like the closing pages of a book. When I broke through the final tangle of branches, I found myself standing in a clearing lined with a perfect circle of campsites. Each site was marked with a wooden post and a neatly carved number, 1 through 12. The symmetry was eerie, almost ceremonial. It felt less like a campground and more like an arrangement meant for an audience. At first glance, it seemed abandoned. The fire pits cold, the picnic tables moss-covered. But when I looked closer, I saw details that didn't fit the decay. A tent pole snapped cleanly in half, its edges sharp and fresh. Footprints preserved in hardened mud, leading nowhere. A lantern resting upright on a table as if someone had just set it down and walked away mid-sentence. My pulse quickened. I'd studied forensic reconstruction in college, learning how the smallest details can reveal the truth about what happened at a scene. Here, every detail screamed of sudden departure, like 12 separate moments frozen in time. I walked the circle slowly, examining each site. At number 4, a child's shoe sat alone beside a cold fire pit. At number 9, a journal lay open on a log, its last page torn out violently. The hairs on my arms rose as I realized each campsite told a different story, and each story ended abruptly. As I pieced together the fragments, a chilling pattern emerged. The journal entries, scattered gear, even the positions of the footprints all matched historical disappearances I'd read about over the years. Different decades, different families, all vanishing without explanation. Somehow, this place was recreating those moments, as though someone was painstakingly arranging a museum of loss. A low wind stirred, carrying the scent of ash and something faintly metallic. My unease deepened when I noticed the circle wasn't perfectly complete. Between sites 6 and 7, a dense wall of brush hid a narrow path barely visible. Curiosity gnawed at me, and against my better judgment, I pushed through the thorns. On the other side lay a 13th site, unmarked, hidden. The air felt heavier here, thick with a stillness that pressed against my skin. There was no abandoned gear, no footprints, just a single unlit fire pit surrounded by stones arranged in a spiral. In the center sat a weathered camera, its lens pointed directly at where I stood. My breath caught as I realized what it meant. The other 12 sites were the past. This one was the present. Behind me, in the distance, something creaked. Slowly, I turned back toward the main circle. The lantern at site number 1 was no longer on the table. It was lit, burning bright against lanterns, pierced the twilight like a watchful eye. My stomach clenched as I stood frozen in the 13th site, a trespasser in someone else's design. I hadn't seen or heard anyone light it, and yet there it was, flame dancing steadily as if it had been burning for hours. The firelight spilled across the other campsites, throwing long, distorted shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. My first thought was to run. Instinct roared in my veins, urging me back through the brush and away from this place. But another part of me, colder and more analytical, kept me rooted. Someone wanted me to see this. The lantern wasn't just a light. It was a signal, a lure. Every detail of this campground had been carefully arranged, like evidence at a crime scene staged to tell a story. And now, somehow, I was part of that story. I forced myself to circle back toward the numbered sites, moving slowly, trying not to disturb anything. At site number 2, a metal cup rested upright beside a log, filled with water that rippled despite the still air. At site number 5, a piece of fabric was pinned neatly to a tree, its edges charred as if from a fire long extinguished. The more I looked, the more deliberate it all became. It wasn't decay I was seeing. It was curation, someone meticulously preserving each clue to keep a narrative alive. Patterns began to emerge. The shoe at site 4, the torn journal at Site 9, the symbols etched into the stones around Site 11, all connected like pieces of a puzzle. My mind raced, drawing lines between them until I realized the truth. Each campsite was a reenactment of a disappearance, and not just random vanishings. These were specific historical cases, families I'd read about in old newspaper archives. Their final moments reconstructed with haunting precision. Then a deeper dread settled in. If 12 sites represented the past, what was the 13th for? The answer came like ice water down my spine. The 13th site wasn't a memorial. It was an active space waiting for the next chapter. I stumbled backward, desperate to leave, when I heard it. A faint click, mechanical and deliberate. My gaze snapped to the camera positioned in the hidden site. Its tiny red light was glowing now, recording. I wasn't just observing the puzzle anymore. I was being written into it. The lantern flames flared brighter, and the forest seemed to lean inward, the trees forming a dark amphitheater around me. I turned in a full circle, my breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. In every direction, shadows gathered just beyond the firelight, indistinct but unmistakably human. As the first shadow stepped forward, I caught a glimpse of its face and nearly collapsed. It wasn't a stranger. It was me, my own expression hollow and unblinking, as if I'd been walking these paths for years. The camera whirred softly, and in that terrible moment, I understood. This place didn't just preserve stories of the vanished. It created them, and tonight, it was writing mine. The night began like any other, a quiet escape into the wilderness with nothing but a telescope, a sleeping bag, and my own restless thoughts. The forest stretched around me like a living cathedral, its branches arched high overhead, the sky a vast dome painted with stars. I'd chosen this ridge because of its elevation and isolation, far from city lights. Up here, the Milky Way shimmered so vividly it seemed almost tangible, like a river of crushed diamonds flowing across the void. I lay on my back, tracing constellations I'd known since childhood. Orion's belt, Cassiopeia, the faint glow of Andromeda. The rhythmic chirping of crickets and the distant lonely call of a night bird formed a comforting soundtrack. Nature has its own symphony, subtle but constant, and I'd always found it soothing. A reminder that the world keeps turning no matter how small we feel beneath the stars. Then, without warning, it stopped. The transition was so abrupt it stole the breath from my lungs. One moment the forest hummed with life. The next, there was nothing. No rustle of wind through the pines, no insect song, not even the distant howl of predators. It was as though someone had pressed a cosmic mute button. The silence was so complete it felt physical, pressing against my eardrums like deep water. Instinct screamed that something was terribly wrong. In the animal kingdom, silence means danger. Birds go still before a storm. Frogs fall silent when a predator approaches. It's a survival mechanism older than language, coded deep in the DNA of every living creature, including us. My pulse quickened, my body responding to an ancient signal my mind couldn't yet explain. I sat up slowly, scanning the tree line. The beam of my flashlight seemed to dissolve into the darkness, swallowed by a mist I hadn't noticed before. My breath sounded unnaturally loud in the stillness, each inhale a violation of the oppressive quiet. Somewhere in the back of my mind, fragments of my astronomy studies surfaced. Atmospheric anomalies can disrupt animal behavior, causing sudden silence. But this felt different, intentional. A flicker of movement caught my eye above the ridge. At first I thought it was a shooting star, a brief bright streak across the sky. But then another followed, and another, until the familiar constellations themselves seemed to shift. Stars that had been fixed points for millennia were subtly rearranging, sliding into new positions like pieces on a celestial chessboard. My rational brain fought to explain it. Optical illusion, fatigue, the atmosphere refracting light in some unusual way. But a deeper, colder voice whispered another possibility. What if the sky wasn't just a backdrop? What if it was part of something alive and we were merely insects beneath its gaze? As I stared upward, paralyzed by awe and terror, I noticed something even more unsettling. The silence below mirrored the movement above, as if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting. The connection was undeniable. Whatever was shifting the stars was reaching down through the night. and it had found me. I wanted to run, to scramble down the ridge and vanish into the trees. But the forest felt different now, wrong, artificial. The ground beneath my boots seemed to hum faintly, like a vast machine hidden beneath the earth. My instincts told me that movement would only draw attention, so I stayed frozen, my head tilted upward, heart pounding so hard it seemed to echo in the stillness. The stars continued to shift. Slowly at first, then with unnerving precision. They formed patterns I didn't recognize, geometric shapes that pulsed faintly like a code being transmitted across the heavens. I'd studied astronomy for years, memorizing the dance of galaxies and the predictable rhythm of celestial bodies. But this was deliberate, intelligent. As the sky rearranged itself, the silence around me deepened until it felt like a living thing, wrapping its hands around my throat. Even my thoughts seemed muffled, as though something was listening. My flashlight sputtered, casting a weak circle of light that illuminated the nearest tree trunks. The bark was split and peeling, not from disease or fire, but from pressure, as though the trees had been gripped by invisible hands. Panic clawed at my mind, but a fragment of scientific reasoning kept me tethered. I thought of the way migratory birds navigate by starlight, how entire ecosystems are guided by celestial cues. If the stars shifted, even slightly, every creature on Earth would feel it. Maybe that explained the forest's unnatural silence. The animals weren't just hiding, they were confused, their instincts scrambled by a sky they no longer recognized. But if they were confused, why did I feel like the only one being watched? My gaze fell to the clearing at the base of the ridge, where my telescope still pointed upward. In the darkness, it looked less like a piece of equipment and more like bait. My journal lay open beside it, pages fluttering, though there was no breeze. And then I saw them, faint impressions in the soil around my campsite. Not footprints exactly, but depressions in the shape of long, slender limbs. They circled my gear in a pattern eerily similar to the one now glowing faintly among the stars. I wasn't alone. I'd never been alone. The realization struck me with paralyzing clarity. This wasn't random cosmic drift or an atmospheric anomaly. This was an experiment, and I was the subject. My movements, my reactions, every note I'd scribbled in my journal had been observed. The shifting sky wasn't meant for the animals. It was meant for me, a maze of light designed to see how long it would take before my mind broke. The stars above realigned one final time, forming a perfect circle directly overhead. A soundless vibration rippled through the forest, and the silence cracked like thin ice. I fell to my knees, hands over my ears, though there was nothing to block. When I dared to look up again, the constellations were back where they had always been, as if nothing had changed. But the footprints remained around my camp, and when I turned to leave, there was a second telescope beside mine, last threads. The horizon bruised with the faintest smear of gray. My campfire was nearly gone, just a circle of glowing coals breathing in the darkness, like the final heartbeat of a dying animal. Around me lay scattered fragments of pages, my journal entries, field notes, frantic sketches of trails and symbols that, when laid side by side, resembled something terrifyingly coherent. Each story I'd gathered, each disappearance, each whisper in the woods, had seemed isolated at first. Now I saw them for what they really were, neurons in a living, breathing network. The forest wasn't just alive in the poetic sense, it was sentient, and we, hikers, campers, wanderers, were the synapses it fired, our fears and memories passing like electricity along its ancient, root-bound pathways. Every scream, every step, every heartbeat fed it, strengthened it, kept it thinking. The realization felt like standing inside the mind of a god, one that did not recognize me as separate from itself. I had been tracing its patterns without even knowing it. Each trail was a branching dendrite, each stone circle a pulse of thought. My journal, filled with obsessive diagrams and recollections, was no longer just documentation. It was a mirror held up to the creature itself, a way for it to see its own reflection through me. The knowledge curdled into horror as I understood what that meant. The forest didn't just want me to write these stories, it needed me to. A low groan rippled through the trees, so deep it felt like it rose from the marrow of the earth. The ground beneath me trembled subtly, pine needles shifting as if stirred by a buried heartbeat. My fire popped loudly, sparks leaping into the night like startled birds. That was when I heard the voices. At first they were faint, indistinct, the way distant conversation sounds when carried by the wind. But as they drew closer, I recognized them. Marcus, Leah, Jenna, names of people whose stories had ended here, their lives devoured by this place. They weren't alive, not really. They were memories the forest had stored, replaying them in perfect mimicry. My breath hitched as I realized what the voices were saying. They were reciting my own journal entries, word for word. The trees around me seemed to lean inward, their branches arching like the ribs of a vast cathedral. The fire's glow painted their trunks in a grotesque, flickering fresco. I felt smaller than ever, a single neuron about to be fired and forgotten. Somewhere deep within the maze of my fear, a thought rose sharp and clear. If memory fed the forest, then destroying my memories might starve it. I grabbed the journal, its pages smudged with ash and sweat, and held it over the fire. My hands shook violently. These pages contained every truth I had uncovered, but they were also the forest's food, the record that allowed it to grow. If I burned them, I could erase myself and perhaps weaken the thing beneath the roots. Behind me, the voices swelled into a deafening chorus. The forest was no longer waiting. It was demanding. As dawn bled slowly into the sky, I realized I had only moments to decide whether to silence it forever, or become part of its eternal story. The voices surged, layering over one another until they became a single, endless sound, a tide of grief and longing pulling at the edges of my sanity. They weren't just memories. They were temptations, bait cast on the hook of my conscience. Each one whispered something I wanted to hear. Marcus pleading for help, Leah promising I wasn't alone, my own name spoken with the intimacy of a lover. The forest knew exactly which threads to pluck, like fingers on the strings of a violin. I hovered the journal over the fire, its edges catching faint licks of orange light. My heart pounded so loudly I could barely hear my own thoughts over the chorus. In that moment, I understood the terrible symmetry of this place. The forest wasn't merely a collection of trees or a network of roots. It was a mind, vast and ancient, mapping itself through us. Each path I had walked was a neural pathway. Each campsite, each disappearance, a synapse, firing with terror. We weren't explorers or victims. We were data points in a thought too immense to comprehend. The scientist in me marveled at the elegance of it. Nature had built its own consciousness, a neural network spanning centuries, using fear as its fuel. But the human in me recoiled. If I destroyed the journal, I could sever my connection to this monstrous organism, erase the stories before they spread to others. Yet a darker realization twisted in my gut. The forest wanted me to burn it. Destruction would not silence it. It would complete the pattern. The wind picked up, though the dawn air had been still moments before. The fire flared high, casting wild shadows across the clearing. And in those shadows I saw figures moving. Familiar shapes, faces I knew. Jenna, Leah, even versions of myself, flickering like images on old film. They stepped closer, mouths moving in perfect unison, reciting the stories I'd written as though they were sacred scripture. I stumbled back, clutching the journal to my chest. The fire crackled violently, sparks spinning upward into the pale sky. The forest seemed to breathe with me, its branches swaying in rhythm to my ragged inhalations. This wasn't a choice between two paths. It was a trap disguised as decision. If I destroyed the book, the cycle would reset. If I kept it, the cycle would expand. Either way, the forest would continue to grow, feeding on the narrative like an addict. The first light of dawn broke through the trees, pale and cold. For the briefest moment, the voices faltered. In that fragile silence, I understood what I had to do. I tore the journal in half, scattering the pages into the fire and into the wind at the same time, splitting the story so it could neither be wholly erased nor wholly consumed. As the final pages turned to ash, the figures dissolved into mist. The clearing fell silent except for the steady hiss of dying embers. When I turned to leave, only a single campfire remained behind me, smoldering faintly in the morning light, a warning or perhaps an invitation for whoever wandered here next. The cycle hadn't ended. It never would. It had simply chosen a new beginning. Subscribe, if you dare.